quite an entrance. All right, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about pixels to property rights, power of NFTs and blockchain. Dr. Jane already actually provided some primers for this, so I can actually skip some of these slides, which is great. But let me first quickly do sort of a quick introduction to Animoca Brands if you don't actually know who we are. Animoca Brands is a company that's been around actually for quite a while, originally in traditional Web 2 gaming. Has gone into Web 3 gaming originally with CryptoKitties. We became publishers and early investors in late 2017, early 2018. Today we have over 450 portfolio companies. We are the owners of companies like The Sandbox, Phantom Galaxies, TinyTap, and a whole bunch of other companies within building basically what we describe also as the open metaverse and Web3. And most recently have been focusing on a way to unify our efforts in something that we call the Mochaverse, which is basically a way in which we want to share our network effect. So I'll describe a little bit about how we think of Web3 and how we believe basically it's going to help build a better future. And the Mochaverse is actually one way in which we try to share that network effect that we've built internally to basically the rest of the open metaverse. But enough of that. Let me quickly talk very quickly about sort of what it is that we're building here. So in the previous talk, you already heard a little bit about sort of some of that, but let me just talk a little bit about sort of how it all started. So what really happened when Web 1 was first developed, we had essentially the early days of the internet. There was a first form of democratization, which was a democratization of access to information. And for those of you, I mean, I think most of you are probably too young, but if you might remember, in the 80s, actually, and 90s, much of the world was driven by information arbitrage, especially in trade and finance, meaning that I knew something that someone else didn't. In other words, if I was someone who was selling rice in America, I would maybe sort of do a deal with someone in China. The person in China had no idea what the true price of rice was because he didn't have the internet, he didn't have that information. And so this gives rise to companies, whether it's the Amazons or the eBays or the Alibabas and those companies that basically sort of destroyed that kind of intermediary effect. When that started to grow in Web 2, we had the ability to write to that web. Basically, this is what we know as a social web. Eventually, this became, in the early days, was MySpace and Friendster, and eventually Facebook. And of course, now with Twitter and all the other social media, the sort of Web 2, as we know it as a social web, became the web of read-write. So we were all able to contribute to that. But there was something that happened when we contributed to the web. It was basically us creating large amounts of data, very valuable data, actually. It's the most valuable resource. And it's actually quite interesting because even in this part of the world where everyone is, where oil and, I guess energy used to be the most valuable resource, there's a recognition now that actually we need to move into the spaces where data, basically, where you have data economies, which are basically creative economies. And that most valuable of resources, being data, has interesting network effects. The reason why data is so incredibly powerful is that it has an unlimited network effect. It has gravity. Gravity in the sense that we can now see today in the effects of AI, in the effects of sort of information systems, and the power of the companies that actually control that data. In other words, when you give more data, and you add more data, and you add more data, and more context to the data, actually the data becomes exponentially more powerful. Even other resources like oil have network effects. You can get energy, you can build plastics, but they actually have limited network effects relative to the kind of network effects that you can build in a construct of data, which is why data is so valuable. But the problem is that most of this data comes from us. We're the ones who are creating that data. We create value. Every time you're sharing a photo on Instagram, maybe you think you're having a good experience and you're getting lots of likes and you're getting lots of feedback, but in reality, you just gave lots of data to Facebook, or lots of data to Amazon, or lots of data to Google. And the thing is, what's valuable about the data isn't the photos themselves, it's actually what the data generates. Every one of us is sharing photos. The data itself isn't worth much, but actually what the photos can generate for the platform about identity, about knowing about your patterns, and knowing about your behavior, the derivative value of that data is valuable. I liken it a little bit like, imagine if you had a piece of land, and someone came in and said, I'm going to drill some oil. I see some oil, so I'm going to drill some sort of oil from your land right now. Normally, you'd say, no way. I myself would not be able to create value out of the oil because I lack the machinery. However, you would not have someone take your oil and basically just take it away. And that's exactly what's happening with data. We're basically just giving it away. We're letting them basically mine our time, our creativity, everything that we're doing, and we give it to the platform because we do not understand its value. What's happened, though, is that those data paradigms have made them so powerful that we live in this kind of digital feudal age. So we're basically, effectively, all of us here are dependents of these sort of, I guess, digital kingdoms. Whether it's the House of Apple, the House of Google, Kingdom of Facebook, Order of Microsoft, you name it, Game of Thrones style, we are complete dependents on these digital kingdoms. There's some interesting examples behind that. For instance, most recently when Elon Musk acquired Twitter and renamed it to X, the person who used to own the X handle for 14 years just lost it. Apparently he was compensated after an outcry. But the person who owned the @music handle, he didn't get compensated, and he just lost it. And the funny story about that one is they said, oh, it's okay, you lost the @music handle because I guess X wanted to go into the music business, but we'll give you the @music handle, which happened to be owned by another person. And the person refused because he said, I'm not going to sort of accept this because I'm not going to be sort of perpetuating one crime for another crime, right? But of course, the reason why that's possible is because we exist on terms of service. We do not have any rights on any of this, right? When Facebook renamed itself to Meta, the person who used to own the metaverse handle had it temporarily gone. Epic, one of the biggest game companies in the world, cannot launch their app on the App Store because of a dispute in terms of basically payments and royalty share. And of course, other companies out there like Minecraft, part of Microsoft, when they decided to ban NFTs, basically just banned an entire company out of the network. And how many companies today on the App Store or on Twitter or on Google or on Facebook get deplatformed? The point is this, that if you are gone from any of these platforms, you actually do not have a digital existence. You don't have an identity. You're not there. But the thing is that we don't have any rights in these platforms. So we are basically digital serfs. And that's a problem we have in Web 2. Now, this is where Web 3 can solve that. Because in Web 3, actually, we now have a way in which we can own that piece. So Dr. James spoke earlier about the Internet of Value. Well, it is an Internet of Value, but the value derives from this fact that we have ownership, meaning this sort of new Internet of ownership, where we can own a piece of the Internet, allows us to derive value because we have property rights attached to them. And that's only possible because this exists on blockchain. Because in the Web 1 and Web 2 paradigms, all the data is in a private database. That private database is in control of, say, Facebook or Epic or Amazon, meaning that whatever you thought you had, whatever existence you had, can be deleted at any time. If you had 1 million followers on Twitter, it could be gone tomorrow. I mean, if even sitting presidents can be removed on any social media platform, it kind of gives you an idea of the kind of power that these platforms wield. But in Web 3, data is not a private good, it is a public good. And can only be sort of changed and altered if there's a consensus, meaning it is a democratic form in which you can actually sort of devise these rights and change these sort of property rights. You need to have agreement from the rest of the network. And that actually ensures the validity of that ownership. In the same way that when you have a democratic system, you can't just remove something from someone. You still need a consensus of an agreement of the, I guess in this case, the population or the elected government in order to remove someone's rights related to that. That's why blockchain is so important for the future of this future new internet of ownership. And this comes down to sort of the important thing about how we understand blockchain. I think a lot of people, often in our industry as well, we sometimes lose people the moment we say blockchain and crypto. This was certainly my experience when I was dealing with a lot of people who were sort of just looking at token prices, for instance, and didn't understand that. The way that I think we need to explain blockchain is that it is essentially a sort of consensus-driven computer system that basically embeds political systems based on a kind of capitalist framework. And that's also why it's sometimes so sensitive, because many people have different views about how we perceive capitalism. You know, maybe 20 years ago, most people might have perceived capitalism in a very positive way. But in recent history, particularly the last 5 or 10 years, lots of young people in particular don't view capitalism in a good way because of what capitalism has done to their societies, what capitalism has done to their own environment. If you look at, for instance, the sort of differential between labor and sort of capital, labor has absolutely underperformed relative to sort of capital appreciation, and so has also actually contributed to sort of all of these sort of wealth inequalities in the world. And that's why it's become so political. So when people think of crypto, they think of a kind of digital capitalism, and it becomes very sensitive. And that's something I think we need to recognize so we can address it and explain to them that actually this is a way which can actually maybe further create a better kind of capitalism, which I'll explain a little later. But the point is this: embedded in blockchain is actually a socio-economic, human kind of framework, which is basically a political system in place. which then allows for it to create basically these type of digital property rights that we see with NFTs, and allows basically these community-owned platforms. The internet today already is kind of community-owned in a certain frame, except we don't own any of the value, we don't have ownership, but we have a sense of ownership, meaning that when there's communities on Reddit, or when there's communities in different forums, or when we're sort of chatting online, we have a sense of kind of control, but not truly. And in Web3, that actually just becomes more powerful because we actually own the actual implied rights because they might be owned in form of NFTs, or we have governance rights attached to it. And really what happens is that they actually start to function very much like little countries or little nations. In other words, what we're seeing with Web3 is the evolution of sort of micronations in terms of, I guess, societal ways that have now actually have economic impact in Web3 because of the paradigm of ownership. Because when you have ownership, then you have value and you have capital formation, and that means you have the creation of essentially what we describe as sort of the open metaverse as a way which is kind of like a small country, which a growing country, which I'll explain shortly. In those countries, in those sort of frameworks, there's, for instance, DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. Earlier this year, I gave a talk where I was talking about how these DAOs, these decentralized autonomous organizations, had $12 billion of value in them. Now, just to sort of give you an idea, this money is community governed. It's not owned by a corporation. It's not owned by a single entity. It has treasuries larger than some of the biggest companies in the world, and they're run entirely by millions of people who basically, like all of us, can vote as to what happens with that money. And today, from the 6 months, despite a bear market, has grown from $12 billion to almost $19 billion as of yesterday. So this is a very, very recent stat. The sort of banking system that sort of underlies this entire sort of economic framework of the open metaverse is DeFi. And I don't mean exchanges. DeFi meaning things that you basically can transact openly on blockchain, like with Uniswap or PancakeSwap or all these things that you can openly sort of transact on. And now the value, being the bear market, has dropped to about $70 billion, which is roughly the size of the National Bank of Greece. But anyway, the point is that you have banking systems basically in the open metaverse that are basically roughly the size of nation states that are fairly sizable, basically mimicking essentially the economies of the real world. The state of Web3 in numbers is about $1 trillion of combined digital asset market value, which is of course mostly in Bitcoin. There's over $100 billion in DeFi. I'm not talking about broad, sort of again centralized exchanges, but only decentralized exchanges in terms of transactions that take place. Lots of value, lots of unique on-chain transactions, $130 billion in stablecoin that are currently being transacted on basically this on DeFi in Web3 at this moment in time, outside of centralized exchanges, meaning that the economic output and the size of economic value that's happening in the Web3 environment is now actually starting to rival that of very sizable nations. Previously, in the start of the year was probably the size of like Cyprus. Now actually it's more like the size of New Zealand. So in other words, it continues to grow despite everything that you might be hearing. The economic activity is actually continuing to increase. And all of that I just described is what we think of as forming part of this open metaverse, as a sort of, Dr. Jane had previously sort of described. Now, why is NFT so important to us? So in this case, because NFTs to us represent the foundation of these digital property rights, meaning that in the same way that we have a sort of system that sort of says what is the value of our physical property rights in terms of our housing or the cars that we own, actually NFTs represent that same paradigm, but in the digital world on blockchain. And the example that I often give is that of cars. Because what happens when you have ownership, actually the assets themselves basically become the assets themselves become platforms and actually then create natural network effects that derive from them. So think about the fact that because we all have ownership of cars around the world, we now have the ability to have thousands and thousands of companies that create services and valuable businesses on top of that of a car in a permissionless manner. Meaning you can create a baby seat for a car and you don't have to talk to Tesla to say, oh, am I allowed to build a baby seat for the car? Or if I want to hire a driver, I don't have to go and hire a driver and ask permission from Volkswagen or Mercedes. Can I hire a driver to use that car? But in Web 2, that's what happens. You can't do anything without seeking for permission. It's an entirely permission environment. But when you start taking these digital assets and make them permissionless, you have the ability to create sort of limitless network effects. And people build new businesses on top of new businesses, as we have seen in the physical world. And today, you no longer buy a car just to take you from point A to point B, as it was 130 years ago. Today, you buy a car because of how it looks, or how fast it is, or how cool it is, or maybe because it's great for your family. There are 1,000 different reasons why you choose to buy a car, just because of the fact that all of these other companies around the world have now built services on top of it and created more value in the car, created more capital opportunities, and actually increased the utility and the value of that. And that's basically what we think will happen with NFTs, ultimately, as these assets start to interoperate with each other. So this means that because of this, you have peer-to-peer ownership economics that start to develop, which we're already seeing an inkling of. It means that when I have, for instance, a skin in Fortnite, if it was on blockchain, which is probably never going to happen, then actually the skin or the assets can actually move from one game to another game. And actually what will happen is it won't be that Epic is going to produce another Fortnite game. It'll be that some game developer around the world might open up Fortnite Fashion Week, or he might open up a Fortnite racing game, or he might open up some kind of experience. And all he has to do is basically allow the people who own these NFTs that were created from the skins of Fortnite, from Epic, and basically give utility for them in a different product, and then they can share revenue from that. In other words, ownership of your assets essentially becomes the way in which you target customers, which is, we think, how it should be. But of course, that's not possible in Web 2 because everything of that ends up obviously being centralized. And in the Web 2 paradigm, people don't want to share their customers. But in Web 3, actually sharing customers is actually better because you create more network effects. You create more access because what happens is that the original value of your originally created content assets becomes more desirable, more valuable, and therefore has more network effects, as it does in the real world. So some examples of this today, for instance, when you look at, for instance, what happened with Bored Apes or Sandbox, you now have close to 1,000 companies that have basically different licenses that are using basically Bored Apes IP. And if you own a Bored Apes NFT, it's not only that you actually own sort of, a funny monkey JPEG, you actually own the commercial rights and the authentic commercial rights around monetizing them. And what's interesting here about the shared network effect is, let's say if someone was selling ape water based on Bored Ape, it's not only that the person who sells that water might benefit from the profits generated from that. Actually, what happens is that every other person who also owns a Bored Ape shares in the prestige. In other words, he shares in the network effects that were generated from the success of that water, or the success of that game, or the success of that comic book, or whatever other success that's out there. So in Web 2, the way that people build these models is by centralizing it, by hiring lots of sales agents, and by creating network effects through marketing, and creating sort of this belief that, hey, this is a great brand, you should all want it, which is what Nike and Disney and those companies do. But in Web 3, it's a participatory network, meaning that you give those rights out to your community, and you let the community basically build it for you because you let them share in that success. So that's the difference. So for instance, in Disney, you might have to hire thousands of sort of sales agents that do the job, but in a Web3 paradigm, say like with Bored Apes, thousands of community members actually do that same job. So it's maybe a similar effect, but with very, very different sort of economic outputs. I give this example a lot. I think for everyone in the audience, in this conference is probably more familiar with this. But often when people struggle with this idea about NFTs and why they're valuable, I give this example of the Birkin bag and the Bored Apes. And I tell people, obviously, that people do not buy this super expensive handbag because they want to put stuff in it. They also don't buy this because of this utility. In fact, if you think about sort of, whether you buy a Rolex watch or if you buy a fast car like a Lamborghini or whatever it is, you're not buying them to take you from point A to point B, and you're not buying a Rolex to tell you the time. These have become social identifiers. They're things that mean to us. They're part of our culture. They're part of our identity. And when you think of everything you're purchasing today, why do you decide to buy the clothes that you do? Why do you decide to buy the shoes that you do? Right? It's if we only buy clothes just because of utility, we'd all be wearing black probably, or white, because it's probably more practical and it's cheap. But in reality, we want to buy things that say something about us, and we're willing to pay premiums for it. We want to be different. We want to express ourselves. And that's basically what NFTs represent in the digital sense. In fact, 99% of the value of any luxury item that you buy today in the world is entirely virtual in value, which is the reason why many of the luxury brands have been first in the metaverse, because they understand that what they're selling is virtual value and storytelling in the first place. And so content and assets and social identifiers is one of the major reasons that we purchase stuff in the world. And it's also one of the major things that we do in video games today. We spend close to $100 billion a year, actually last year and probably this year more, in literally buying skins, trinkets, virtual goods in Web2 games. Basically things that we don't even get to own. You know, Call of Duty, Roblox, all these things we don't actually own, and we spend that kind of money on things that give us social status, prestige, and all these things that basically sort of matter to us in the real world in different ways, but in the physical world, certainly to our children, is actually what they care about. So this is already happening right now. And the potential, of course, is that to take this sort of paradigm of Web2 assets, of Web2 content, and virtual goods, and turn them into real assets, NFTs, is one of the reasons why Web3 gaming has always been considered one of the biggest sort of potentials in the space, which is why we're also invested in that. All right, I'm going to cover very quickly just a couple areas of examples. First of all, why gaming? Unlike other industries, gaming is probably the digital-first industry that impacts physical worlds versus others the other way around. In other words, if it wasn't for gaming and the virtual sort of games, we wouldn't have PlayStation, we wouldn't have Nintendo, we wouldn't have Xbox, we wouldn't have NVIDIA, we wouldn't have fast GPUs, we wouldn't have sort of curved screens, we wouldn't have crazy keyboards. All the stuff that we're buying today or we're using actually came from gaming. Gaming was a utility that drove these hardware and cultural experiences that we have today. But it came from digital first. And that's why gaming is such a unique construct, because it is a digital first experience that impacts the physical world, not the other way around. The other thing that's interesting is that it's now a $200 billion plus business. Depending on who you talk to, it's actually maybe even close to 250. And it's something that most of the world does today. Over 3 billion gamers are playing games on a regular basis, and that number is actually, I think, closer to 3.4 billion today, which is basically roughly more than 2/3 of the world's internet. And what's also interesting is that the economics of gaming is something that is often misunderstood. So when people talk about gaming and Web3 gaming and play to earn, people often misunderstand actually what's happening there. So in traditional gaming, less than 3% of the world actually converts into playing games. So everyone here probably who plays some games on a mobile, chances are that most of you will have never paid for your game. You're the 97 to 99%. That's very normal. But it is in fact the 1 to 3% that drive the billions and billions of dollars of value. And the reason they do that is because they're willing to spend against the people who play the games for free. So the reason why the people who are playing for free do that is because they believe they have fun. But of course, the reason why the people pay for it is because they have people to compete against. Imagine if you go to a game lobby and you have nobody to shoot at in Fortnite or in PUBG, then they wouldn't pay any money. So in fact, all the people who are playing the game for free are basically like sort of shooting ducks, if you will, right? Your target practice for them. And that's the entertainment value. You're basically sort of trading your time for money versus the other way around. So that's how the industry works. And what happens in Web3 gaming is, because everything is on chain, you can now actually calculate that value and share that value. Because all what blockchain does is it opens up the financial sort of value infrastructure of gaming to the world. In other words, if I knew that you and you and you who played with this guy made him pay $1,000, then I can choose to say, okay, I can share half of that value to those 3 players who have made that other person pay money as a result. Now, this is already possible in Web2 games, but the only company that knows that is a game studio. And in Web3, the rest of the world knows that and can basically build businesses on top of that. That's the difference there. The other thing is that gaming is such a big business that it drives a lot of online advertising, about $100+ billion a year in what they call performance marketing. But the beneficiaries of that are primarily Google, Facebook, Apple, and those companies. How much of that value that is spent of the $100 billion goes back into the gaming industry? And the answer is almost nothing. So outside of the 30% tax that they take, they also extract huge value in terms of advertising. In other words, they charge huge amounts of rent, and almost none of it comes back into the ecosystems that are developing it, which is not that different from people who are building, I guess, restaurants or shops or businesses and on the properties of landlords. The same type of effect. So the paradigm that's changed here, for instance, is when people give out NFTs, is that they're actually sharing the value of that NFTs as a form of marketing. So if you're giving out free NFTs as a way of marketing, it's no different than spending money, dollar marketing, except that now you're giving it to your end users, and a portion of these end users might convert, right? Because there's actually, so you're paying the users to participate in the game rather than you're paying a platform to promote the game. Slightly different paradigm, but the same effect. And so it changes the business model, and it changes essentially the way that you can do marketing. So Phantom Galaxies was the first one to do that, but now quite a few Web3 NFT companies basically do exactly the same thing. Other things that people do to change sort of the paradigm of business here is for instance, revenue share, right? So here's an example what Rec League has done. What Rec League does is that you can play the game. It's a AAA fighting game. But in this game, the people who own the Web3 assets, their assets can be generated as Web2 assets for people who play the Web2 game. Right? But that means that the people who pay in the Web2 game, which is not one of owned, essentially rented, share 50% of the revenue to the people who own the Web3 assets. So again, you create essentially a microeconomy within the gaming environment as a way to do that. So there's still experimentation going on. The point, though, is that you can now create these financial constructs in Web3 games that you couldn't really do before in Web2. And then, of course, yeah, I'll just skip that part. Now, this I wanted to share a little bit as a different interesting idea around what's possible with Web3 and NFTs. This is around teachers. This is an example with TinyTap and Open Campus. One of the things that often isn't possible to capitalize is content, especially when content is only worth maybe $100 or even $1,000, because the cost of a lawyer, the contract rights, everything is very expensive. But through the sale of an NFT, you can embed both the contractual rights, where the money goes, legal frameworks, IP rights in one single transaction for under $1. That means you can start to capitalize things that might be only worth $100 or $10 or $20 a year. So imagine you're a teacher in Venezuela, your monthly salary is $16 a month, you can make educational content, it might make you $10 or maybe $20 a year, and in terms of additional content. You can now sell that through an NFT as a contractual contract, and someone else can now enjoy the benefit of that yield. So meaning that person is now willing to pay maybe $50 or $100 for that content because this person might be willing to take it for a 10 or 20% yield. So it means you can create capital formation on even the smallest of assets. And that's really one of the true powers of what happens when you give property rights, basically in the digital context. It's not just, gaming assets or, Bored Apes or expensive assets. It's actually down to things that are worth only $5 or $10 because now they could be worth $50 to $100 in a capital sort of formatted type of way. And so this is what you see happening in things like TinyTap. And this is an example of she's actually Israeli, but there's another sort of American teacher that basically sold content, and they made literally a year's worth of their salary or more than that on the sale of their NFTs when they started doing that. So again, there's context there that this space is not just for artists or gamers, it's basically for everyone who's basically creating content. Okay, so very quickly, one of the big values of Web3 is it aligns network participants to share across and align and participate in network. We can see that already today. In the Web2 world, most of the value goes to investors and builders, and in Web3, generally speaking, the most successful models is one where everyone gets a slice of it. In other words, everyone becomes a stakeholder in the network. And the stakeholder alignment comes through ownership. And this can be in the form of NFTs, it can be in the form of virtual land, it can be in all sorts of forms, it can be in forms also of governance. So for instance, now, when you own tokens, in DAOs, you can actually vote on them, right? And so you have now not only ways in which you can vote yourself, with the tokens you own, there's now super PACs, and there's government and style structure, delegate structures like you have with Mochaverse, where if you are a member of the Mochaverse community, you actually have the ability to vote on ApeCoin, on EDU, on Sand, on a variety of other networks as a result of that, because you basically have governance rights in those structures. And we think DAOs are basically going to be the future organizations run in this sort of community-run way. All right, some closing thoughts. And this is exactly why we think Web3 will win. In 2022, NFTs sold about $24 billion. This year will probably be a bit less, but it'll still be in the $15 billion plus at least. And the point, though, is not that it's $24 billion, but that 90% went to creators and owners of these NFTs. Meaning, while the platforms made a reasonable fee, the majority went to the owners of these assets. Whereas in Web2, Spotify, which is probably the largest music network in the world, only paid out about $7 to $8 billion in that same year in terms of royalty rights, despite serving hundreds of millions of users and over 8 million creators, as an example. And apparently this year, they're only paying out $3 billion. I'm not sure how that works, but the point being, you can see that on Spotify's website, the point being that the economics for anyone in the content creator economy is just so much greater in Web3 that ultimately, once you are in the Web3 space, you actually, it's just so much better. And as a result, we don't think that there's really a path to Web2 Web 2 to sort of succeed long term. All right, closing thoughts on AI. I only have a few minutes. First of all, we think that AI and Web 3 are very intertwined. In the gaming space, the one AI thing that we're mostly engaged in today are NPCs, non-player characters. They're dumb AI, they tell us what to do in games, and we do stuff like that. But basically with large language models and Web3, you can create these autonomous gaming sort of NPCs that we believe are not only going to sort of have more dialogue, and they're also going to transact and become autonomous. Meaning that in the same way that I talked about NFTs being able to be used in different games, you should expect NPCs to be able to play in different games and be in different environments because they're essentially autonomous agents. And they're going to be transacting with each other, right? They're not just going to be transacting with humans. And what are they going to be transacting is? They're going to be transacting with crypto. Basically, a digital native construct is only going to be transacting with a digital native currency, which is basically crypto. So we think it's going to sort of drive that. And of course, the way that we protect our intellectual property rights is also going to be basically with blockchain. This is a famous example. Stability was sued by Getty Images because Getty Images found out that they were using their photos to train their AI learning models. But the only reason they were able to do that is because Stability was sloppy. You can see the Getty Images watermark all over the images that they used there. Most of us are not going to be in that situation. So how do you protect ourselves? Again, on-chain hash, blockchain, basically is a way in which we can protect our intellectual property rights to know whether the source of that data was used. And so the way we could imagine the future is that if you're an artist, and if the AI generated value from your art, from maybe even 1 million artists, it can actually, through blockchain, share the value to those 1 million artists that was generated as a result of that. Again, a kind of rights management system that you can't really do in classic Web 2, but you can do in Web 3. Okay, so this is one of my favorite slides. I keep talking about it. There's a very clear correlation between the countries and nations that actually have strong property rights. They also have much more freedoms, and as a result have much higher GDPs. So places like the UAE, the US, Hong Kong, Singapore, Europe, they all have very, very strong property rights, therefore also very strong freedoms. Versus the kind of countries that have very low property rights to no property rights on the extreme side, like North Korea, where maybe they have a lot more people, but they don't have any economies worth speaking of. And they're also the ones that don't enjoy all of these rights. And to us, they're intertwined. I close with this thought, famously put out by George Washington, freedom and property rights are inseparable. You can't have one without the other. And the same is true for digital. Thank you.